Welcome back. President Jimmy Carter regularly taught Sunday school at Maranatha Baptist Church in his hometown of Plains, Georgia, for decades, even after announcing his cancer diagnosis in 2015. His teachings often focused on what the Bible says in relation to serving the poor and forgiveness. Joining us now for more is a pastor who has preached at that Baptist church and spent time with the Carters, whose doctoral work also focuses on the theologies of the American presidents. The Reverend Dr. Robert W. Lee, who you might remember him from previous times on the show for his work as an activist in the field of racial reconciliation, and a descendant of Civil War Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start with this first. There has been such an outpouring since folks found out about President Carter's death yesterday. Probably not surprising to see this kind of reaction.
It's not surprising, but it's still remarkable because if you look at it, we have people from President Trump to President Biden, Obama, Bush, Clinton, all issuing statements hailing Carter as one of the most nice, compassionate, kind individuals that have ever held the office of president. It's one of those things, it feels a little bit like the end of an era too, like we're not getting what we used to have in Carter now. But all that's to say is for this outpouring to be so public, to be so prolific about this man, this humble peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, is really, really stunning.
To see this man who was in the most powerful position in the world go back to his church and go back to preaching in his church. For somebody who is in religion themselves, how important is it for you to see somebody do that?
I think it shows Carter's humility. I think it shows that he knew how to wield power, but to also let it go when the time came. I think there are lessons in those realities for all of us to learn now, and there will be plenty of time to study Carter's legacy. There's already plenty of corpus work on who Carter was, what Carter offered the world. But I think in the end of the day, we can see him as a person who championed peace, who championed goodwill to humankind, not only here domestically, but also with foreign policy. And we see him as someone who showed us how to live a life of faith. And as a pastor, that gives me great hope as someone who looks at a landscape of political realities right now that aren't as full of goodwill or peace or religiosity as well.
So listen, you've had an experience that so many people have never had before. You've actually gotten to spend time with the Carters. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, in 2018, I was invited to preach at his church, Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. It was one of those moments where you realize I'm going to preach for a president. I had a professor in seminary who said, just remember they're people too when you preach to people that are very important. Right. So I tried to remember that. And President Carter didn't disappoint. I played second fiddle to him that day, though he taught Sunday school and I was preaching the sermon. People were there to see President Carter. And he was kind enough to the point that even after the service, if you stayed through the worship service, he would take his picture with you. And Rosalind came up, and of course she was living at the time, and took the picture too. And it was just a wonderful time to see that. After the Carters were all done, my wife and I, my whole family had come. We walked up, and he was kind to me about the sermon, but he quickly got to my wife, Stephanie, and asked her, hey, Stephanie, do you know how to cook? And Stephanie responded that she did, and he pulled out of his wallet a recipe that was Rosalind's lasagna that he wanted cooked that night. And we could come to dinner if we cooked that lasagna. I was looking over at Stephanie, silently pleading that she would accept the challenge to cook President Carter's favorite lasagna. Yeah. And she accepted the challenge, and she did great. The Secret Service even complimented her on her lasagna. And to dine with the president is an honor of a lifetime as someone who's a scholar of the American presidency. I was eating it up. I wanted to ask so many questions. I had a list ready. All he wanted to do was talk about us and our lives and who we were and what we were doing in the world and how he was concerned with where the world was. And that speaks again to the character and how he wielded power of this man. He was the most powerful man in the world at one time, but he was interested in the people around him too.
Do you think that as we look back on him, obviously there's very few people who can say, I was a president of the United States, but do you think that it's the work after his time in the presidency that most folks are going to be remembering him for? This going back home?
Yeah, I think most certainly there is some reimagining right now of how we tell the story of President Carter, especially with the Iran hostage crisis, with recent revelations that show that there was more at work there than we knew about at the time. So I think there will be a reimagining of his presidency as maybe more successful than some thought it was. Of course, there were the gas shortages. There was plenty to go on. It's a time not unlike our own. So I think it would be very important for us to right now to take a moment, to take a breath, and to really study this man for who he was, what he offered this country, and what this country chose to accept from him, because there is so much available, not only with his work in the presidency, but also with the Carter Center, with the elimination of the guinea worm, with his work to champion peace in the Middle East. There's so much that he did that we have our work cut out for us in terms of studying the presidency and life of President Carter.
I think a lot of people agree with that. It's been amazing to me to watch the memories that folks have, the people who have taken steps to get a chance to see him, and you got to have dinner with him.
we are far better off because of President Carter.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story about this.
Thank you.